Welcome to today's combined LS Language and Social Processes and Second Language Research SIG webinar. This is our second in this year's series. And today we're excited to bring together such a great group of scholars to talk about a new volume that you'll get to learn lots more about today. And the title of today's webinar is Reconceptualizing the Role of Critical Dialogue in American Classrooms, which is certainly continuously feeling more and more pressing. As you can see, we are asking you to share your name, affiliation, and why you're here in the chat. And also, if you are on Twitter, we encourage you to live tweet during today's webinar. I'm going to turn it over now to Amanda to get us started.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much to both the Language and Social Processes SIG and the Second Language Research SIG for hosting this event. Great to see among participants, friends, and colleagues, so welcome everyone. The facilitators today, just want to let you know who will be leading our webinar. So I'm Amanda Kibler from Oregon State University. A co-facilitator is Dr. Guadalupe Valdez from Stanford University and Dr. Aida Walke from West Ed. And we have invited as facilitators of this group 4 very esteemed teacher educators to be panelists to really engage in a conversation with us about the implications of teacher education of the work that we've done. And so we have today joining us Dr. Luis Posa from San Jose State, Dr. Emily Machado from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Wayne Wright from Purdue University, and Dr. Deb Palmer from the University of Colorado Boulder. And so I'd like to start by briefly explaining a little bit about the genesis of the book upon which this webinar is based, which was edited by Dr. Valdez, Dr. Walke, and me. In our work as pre and in-service teacher educators and as researchers, we are more than well aware of the inequitable and discriminatory ideologies, the institutional structures, and the social practices that exclude linguistically minoritized multilingual children and youth from equitable classroom learning experiences. Yet, we hold firm in our belief that classrooms are where radical transformation and change can take place. Dialogic educational practices are one such way to accomplish this work, because language is at the heart of learning. As important as notions of classroom dialogue and discourse are, however, we find that they must also be accompanied by a critical viewpoint. And we outline in the next slide what some of those pieces are. I know you have access to the slides. And this critical viewpoint recognizes and actively challenges the linguistic and racialized norms and perspectives that often limit students' opportunities. This approach calls for a profound rethinking of what teaching and learning is, the materials we use, and teachers' and students' roles in the process. So in refining these ideas, we hit upon the umbrella term of critical dialogic education to describe equity-focused classroom pedagogies and the teacher mindsets that are needed to enact them that are dialogic, critical, and inclusive. This brings us to the 2 key components of critical dialogic education, or CDE, that we've identified, related to both critique and to action. So this builds on the importance of classroom dialogue in developing interactional and communicative expertise, but it questions power dynamics that are inherent within this dialogue. So that's the critique part, but it doesn't stop there. It moves to action as well. So CDE enacts a proactive vision to provide spaces for students to develop their voices and disrupt inequitable power dynamics inside and beyond classrooms. So in the 4th slide, I believe, you'll see an image of the edited volume that we put together, and it sets out these parameters for CDE. And it also gathers examples and analyses from classroom practitioners and researchers engaging in this work. We have an amazing set of authors for each chapter, and they describe their own takes on what critical dialogic education is and the diverse pedagogies and practices through which they've enacted it. So I want to give you a quick sense of this work. You'll see the titles of the chapters and the authors, but I want to give you a quick snippet of what each is about so you understand a little bit about what we'll be discussing the implications of. So our first 2 chapters focus on curricula that are explicitly critical in nature, addressing topics of social justice movements in the first instance and sociolinguistic justice in the second. and the ways that dialogue is facilitated by teachers and used by adolescents who are both more experienced users of English in the first chapter and newer users of English in the second. And in these cases, students' own experiences with discriminatory practices and biases were really critical to their engagement with the topics of study. Our third chapter examines interactions during inquiry-based dialogic science instruction in a linguistically diverse fifth grade classroom. And it explores how small group talk has the potential to create equitable learning environments when learning activities are carefully designed and facilitated, and when peers, teachers, and researchers view linguistically minoritized students as worthy conversation partners, able to engage with and extend others' ideas related to scientific sense making. Our fourth chapter inverts traditional power structures by involving students themselves in research on dialogic pedagogies. In this case, with Poetry Inside Out, a dialogic curriculum that focuses on collaborative discussions that explore students' perspectives on the social and cultural contexts, not only of the poems that they're studying and translating, but of their own lives. The fifth chapter compares the ways in which both institutional contexts and teachers' pedagogical practices influence the ways in which teachers and students enact dialogic practices. In this case, when the topic of study is immigration, and students themselves have a range of different lived transnational and immigrant experiences. And finally, the sixth chapter explores the ways in which racialized linguistic bias influences African American college students, and the ways that dialogic and critically oriented university coursework can involve these students and others as sociolinguistic researchers to explore and validate the linguistic and cultural practices in their own communities. So you can tell a great set of chapters. We're also very excited. I see several of our authors who have joined us in the audience today. So thank you very much. So hopefully this gives you a sense of the work upon which today's webinar is based. Our conversation today focuses specifically on the implications of critical dialogic education for teacher education. So we've invited a wonderful panel of teacher education scholars who specialize in promoting equitable spaces for linguistically minoritized students. They are joining us for a conversation, which Dr. Walke will facilitate, about the rationale for, the potential of, and the complexities involved in helping teachers learn to implement critical and dialogic classroom discourse practices and curricula. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Walke and invite you all to add your questions through the chat, which I'll be monitoring throughout the discussion and trying to integrate as best I can. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. Our conversation is going to be conducted in two moments. In the first one, I have a couple of questions that I would like you to take turns discussing from the perspective of the chapter that you focused on. And then in the second part, you will all be invited to engage in dialogue along a number of ideas that are relevant for teacher educators. So from your reading of the chapters that you focused on, what is critical dialogic education, and how do the authors of the chapter discuss the way in which teachers and students challenge the typical when they exist, dialogic interactions in class, or challenge in general the frontedness and authority that teachers exercise in classrooms. So to begin with the first two chapters, Emily.
So first, let me thank the editors and authors for the opportunity to read and respond to these excellent chapters. I actually reviewed chapter 1 and chapter 3, so I'll kind of be going between those two rather than chapter 2. So more than anything else, one thing that I appreciated about this book as a whole and about each chapter that I read was the way, as Amanda put it, that it simultaneously acknowledged the challenges of critical dialogic education while maintaining this really steadfast conviction around its power and potential in classroom spaces. This simultaneous recognition of challenge and potential even seems to me to be woven into the CDE approach itself, particularly as it includes this constant questioning of the purpose of dialogic interactions and the power dynamics that they can potentially reify or disrupt. This emphasis on challenge as well as potential gave the chapters that I read this real sense of authenticity that I think is really going to help them speak to the experiences of teachers and researchers and teacher educators alike. So first, I had the pleasure of reading chapter 1 by Dialogic and Dialogic. And in this chapter, the authors explored this unit of instruction in a classroom of students who were bureaucratically designated as long-term English learners. So while students in this, with this designation often receive reductive and shallow teaching due to a variety of structural factors that are outlined really clearly at the beginning of the chapter, the unit showcased here was just so rich in its content and its teaching methods. It foregrounded themes related to injustice and protest and social change around the globe, and used a variety of different dialogic participation structures to offer students multiple opportunities to construct knowledge collaboratively. So including things like a silent graffiti discussion to kind of dialogue around really powerful photographs from history and also contemporarily. I think there's no greater testament to the power of this work than the fact that at the end of the unit, the students approached their teacher about conducting their own critical inquiry into youth incarceration, which was a pressing issue within their community. And then chapter 3, which was written by Laura Alvarez and colleagues, explored critical dialogic education within several 5th grade science classrooms. This chapter documents the implementation of a critical dialogic science curriculum, which was designed by the research team. Specifically, this curriculum sought to create opportunities for productive dialogue, or what they call productive dialogue for multilingual students, in which students could build on each other's emergent ideas to make sense together, take up affordances in their environments to support their participation, and to deepen their disciplinary understandings. And this research team's stance was really explicitly critical in its attention to multilingual students' power and agency, positioning them as really capable scientists and communicators. At the same time, again, coming back to that idea of potential and challenge, it also highlighted challenges and pitfalls where moments of sort of unproductive dialogic interaction occurred in these classrooms, when students sort of fell back into dominant discourses that reified schoolish ways of understanding. So for example, in one point that I thought was really powerful was when the students became so focused on using a sentence stem that they actually stopped considering the content of their peers' responses. So across both chapters, I was really compelled by this simultaneous holding of potential and challenge and its possibility for our work as teacher educators. We know that we need to work intentionally to disrupt dominant notions of schooling, as well as deficit notions about families and communities and children that are sometimes brought into our teacher education classrooms. But at the same time, I left the chapters with the conviction that our classrooms themselves have potential to be sites where teacher candidates might experience what it feels like to build dialogically and critically, and to use these experiences to disrupt the dominant notions. I think giving teacher candidates opportunities to experience CDE themselves is particularly important for those who maybe didn't have such opportunities frequently in their own educational experiences. So what might it look like for teacher candidates to build in a critical dialogic fashion in response to videos of classroom practice or in meaning making around a sample of student writing? And how can we give them opportunities to reflect on these experiences and discuss how they might implement principles of CDE in their own classroom contexts? So I also think it's important for us to acknowledge the sort of complexity and messiness of CDE approaches with our teacher education students. We can be transparent with them that taking up a critical dialogic approach might be messy and will require regular questioning and reflection. However, I think as all of the chapters take up, the one area where we must be unwavering is in constantly positioning students who are linguistically minoritized in schools as powerful and agentic, and building opportunities for classroom practice that reaffirms this stance.
Thank you very much for having raised so many wonderful issues. I'm sure many others will be raised as well. So why don't we go to you, Luis? And although this may not be in order, it doesn't matter. Just refer to the chapters that you read.
Absolutely. So I do want to reiterate the thanks for you, Aida, Guadalupe, Amanda, for editing this volume, to the Second Language Research SIG and the Language Social Processing SIG, and certainly to our whole audience. It's exciting to see how many people are joining in from so many different places. I had the good fortune of reading I was assigned to read chapters 4 and 6. I couldn't help myself from reading others because they were so exciting and engaging. But so I read chapter 4 and 6. Chapter 4 is Translating Words and Worlds in Poetry Inside and Out. First authored by Jia Park, but as part of a research group that included students, classroom teachers, and researchers, which is really, that kind of collaboration in itself says something about a critical dialogic approach. Right? And then chapter 6 is Empowering African-American Student Voices in College by Ann Charity Hudley and colleagues as well. And so in chapter 4, what we have is kind of a look inside a classroom, particularly a poetry curriculum called Poetry Inside and Out, where students are given poems written in a language other than English, some basic kind of tools with which to translate them, but they're translating them in small groups, or in pairs at first, and then those pairs group, and then those groups of 4 present to the whole class. And just in this iterative process, numerous stages of dialogue and debate, debating the meaning of certain words, debating the power and impact of certain literary devices and things like that that are included in poetry, which can be so rich. And what I really loved about it more so than, I think just the opportunities for dialogue was sort of the selection of the poems themselves. The poem that's presented as a case in this chapter is one written by an immigrant who's being sort of held at Angel Island, right, waiting for the opportunity to come to the mainland. And so in the course of the conversations around the poem, we have these rich conversations, not only what does this word mean, what's the best way to say it, but geopolitical conversations about immigration and status, and by status, I mean kind of social equity status or social equality status within a society, and kind of transnationalism and transnational identities, and students at varying degrees of English proficiency as assessed in kind of metrics that we use to assess it, right, are having these conversations with each other, right? And so within that chapter, I mentioned that it's this nice kind of interdisciplinary, sort of intergenerational research team putting it together. They also kind of foreground different voices at different times. So the chapter speaks to what it was like to go through this as a student, what it was like to teach this unit, what it was like to sort of observe the student as a university-based researcher and as a student participatory researcher. And so, looking through those lenses, they came up with not always aligned understandings of what productive dialogue was, but with this very kind of multidimensional structure of what it is. And what kind of comes across through all of that is this synthesis that dialogue is, it involves reciprocity, it involves mutual recognition. And so they call it special listening, right? This idea that we're listening not only to the words you're attending, but we're listening to the experiences, the identity that informs those words, that informs that meaning, right? And I think so often when we work with our teacher candidates, because what we can observe is the speech, right? When we tell our teacher candidates to promote dialogue and to promote talk, we want to just see that both sides are talking, right? Both students in a dyad are talking, right? Or 3 students in a triad, that they're all talking, right? But how do we know they're listening, right? And especially when we're talking about these issues of equity and social positioning and things like that, how do we know that they're engaged in this special listening, right? This way of incorporating others' views and others' experiences into their own understanding, right? Not only of the content, but of sort of broader humanistic endeavors, as what the chapter really highlighted. And then I think really similar themes came out in chapter 6, or the Empowering African-American Student Voices in College, where the lens of inquiry was very different. So this was sort of twofold inquiry. One was exploring the experiences of Black undergraduate students at a range of institutions, some historically Black colleges and universities, other predominantly white institutions, right? Inquiring about their experiences around language use and kind of their own awareness of their linguistic practices, their own awareness of the ways that their linguistic practices were being surveilled and judged and evaluated. And, and I think, right, consistent with what we know of the research, right, is that students are hyper aware of the ways that their languaging is judged and policed, right, in certain settings and deemed appropriate. And that they really wrestle with this tension of fitting in, but of also being authentic to themselves and to kind of the familial or community upbringing that has supported them thus far, right? And that to which they want to go back and give back, right? That education is very rooted in this desire to serve community and family and stuff in some ways. And so in some ways, engaging in particular linguistic practices almost feels like turning back on that. But then the second piece was exploring students' experiences in classes that very specifically affirmed, right, African-American English and kind of the community linguistic practices of students, and gave them opportunities to work through community engaged projects, right? Exploring language use in communities, using their own their broad linguistic repertoires and their full linguistic repertoires in community engaged work. And so again, you know, we see this the importance of listening, right, as part of dialogue, right? And the importance of having purpose and giving students that agency. So these students were, you know, really determining their own kind of community projects. They were setting their own research agendas as undergraduates, right? They were you know, doing some of the, you know, doing this work, exploring linguistic variation or exploring students' experiences in schools or in places like that, or with other social services, and through that felt a sense of belonging that they hadn't felt elsewhere, right, in their higher education experience. And so I think what comes across really powerfully across both chapters is, you know, what Emily noted before, right, is just this importance of this constant vigilance, right, against the kinds of power relations that would sort of suppress those opportunities for expression and productive dialogue, and for speaking as our whole selves, right, for bringing our whole selves into a conversation.
Thank you, Luis. You have added many more excellent elements, and especially not only the reciprocity and the fact that, you know, you need to build intersubjectivity, but the nature of the texts that really generate that agentive aspect on students. So why don't we move to Deb, and would you kindly then follow?
Yes, absolutely. I had the pleasure of focusing on chapter 5, which was Tatiana Klein and Dina Lopez's chapter. Though I have to confess, I have read most of the book at this point. And so I want to thank the editors and the authors who are here with us today. I'm thanking the editors for a sneak peek, for the opportunity to get a chance to read these chapters before they're even out. And all of the authors for the fabulous work that does come together into a really nice volume. So, but to take a look at chapter 5, this was a chapter that focused particularly on secondary students engaging in the history classroom around ideas of immigration. So there were lots of things I could draw from to share with you about this chapter. The first thing is that I was really struck by the theoretical framing. The authors chose to put together a Bakhtinian with a Freirean frame. It's a pairing that I've done myself, so I was really intrigued to hear how they put that together. The Freirean praxis cycle and critical consciousness and development of critical consciousness in the classroom, but paired with Bakhtin's idea of moving from a monoglossic position as a teacher into a heteroglossic position as a teacher was a really nice way to sort of envision the kind of dialogic pedagogies they were talking about, what they were defining as critical dialogic education in that chapter. It's also important to note that the data for this chapter was collected in 2010, 2011. Now that was a long time ago now. So I'm guessing that when the authors first collected the data, they didn't have in mind this particular location for it, right? This particular framing. So these were 2 pairs of teachers working in 2 different high school contexts in New York City, one working with recent immigrant kids in a academically strong newcomer space, and the other working with American-born kids, some of whom were children of immigrants, most of whom were students of color. And the teacher pairs were also very different as accommodated their contexts, right? So one thing this chapter spoke to really well for me was the importance of context in how one frames a critical dialogic experience. The kids' work was inspiring across the board. So the chapter was full of rich examples of kids dialoguing with themselves and with one another around idea, and with public figures and with policies around the current climate around immigration at that time. And at the same time, teachers were very, very deliberate in the ways that they structured the experiences for kids to have. So I came away with the importance of curriculum in terms of the teachers thinking through what items to choose and how to have students interact with artifacts around ideas in order to stimulate conversations, like which things were most likely and least likely in particular contexts with particular kids to stimulate rich conversations, and the situatedness of that was relevant, right? I also came away with the ways that the teachers' skill sets came to bear. So the teachers leveraged what they knew about their kids, about their contexts, about the content, and about the curricular goals they had for, the standards and high stakes tests they were managing, and came out with engagement with the topic, much like I'm hoping we're going to engage here, right? A dialogue with ideas that spoke both directly about oppression and structures of power, and within the structure of the lessons working explicitly against structures of power. So there was a multi-layeredness to it too. That was a really neat thing to see these two scholars kind of pull this data into this frame and take a look at how it applied in this space. So it's an excellent chapter. I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Deb. And once again, thank you for bringing many more really relevant issues, and especially the importance of context, and that makes these conversations really flourish. So why don't we go to Wayne now?
Thank you very much. And again, it's an honor to be a part of this panel. I also read several of the chapters, but I'll focus on chapter 2, which was written by Jin-Suk Lee and her colleagues. The title is School Kids Investing Language and Life in Society, or Skills, and that's the actual name of this program. It's a 20-week outreach program. They do it as a university school partnership, and they've been very successful in carrying out this program before with multilingual students, but who are English proficient. And so this chapter describes their first time effort to apply it with students at a lower level of English proficiency, specifically at an ELD level 2 class at a high school in California. What's nice about this chapter is it's refreshingly honest. The subtitle is Growing Pains in Creating Critical Dialogic Learning Opportunities. And I really appreciated the authors who helped design the skills curriculum, and also some of them are graduate students who helped carry it out in the classroom. And so they describe it, then they reflect on their successes and some of the things that weren't so successful in doing it. So just as a little bit of context, the class had about 18 multilingual learners in there. Most of them have been in the United States for 2 to 4 years, predominantly Spanish speaking, although there were a few indigenous speakers in there, as well as a Mandarin and a Tagalog speaker. And their typical ELD class structure was very teacher driven. They would spend about half the time doing computer software stuff. Then they would do some reading comprehension exercises and then some textbook tests. So what is CDE? Not that, okay? So the skills is really trying to help create a culture shift in the classroom. Student-centered, focus on engaging students in extended critical conversations about these sociolinguistic topics within the skills curriculum. So really creating that new classroom culture. So again, they talk about these growing pains. And so a lot of the article is reflecting on kind of the missed opportunities for teaching practices that could get the students more into that critical, dialogic, inclusive classroom interaction. They thought they could take their skills curriculum and just kind of implement it wholesale in this new context. And they found that they didn't anticipate the need to modify that. They found that a lot of the topics weren't as relevant or relatable to students within this particular class than when they did it with English proficient multilingual students. And so they found that, just at the beginning, they had trouble even getting the kids to talk, let alone engaging in critical dialogue. And they had more success about halfway through when they, turned the focus of the content to reflect more on the students' unique experiences as multilingual learners. And then they were a little more willing to talk. So specifically, they gave 2 examples of some really, I think, highly engaging lessons that they did. So one was on language policing from a racial linguistics perspective. They watched a couple of YouTube videos. One, some of these might be instances you're familiar with. One was a New Jersey teacher who was yelling at some students that who were speaking Spanish that, quote, "brave men and women are not fighting for your right to speak Spanish," and telling the kids to, quote, "speak American." And then there's another YouTube video that was, by I think a Latinx YouTuber who talked on the topic of why are Latinos policed for speaking Spanish. So again, very highly engaged topics that the students could have some thoughts about. And the other lesson looked at memes that included mock nahuatl. So essentially they were putting like the LT at the end of Spanish words and kind of making fun of nahuatl speakers in the nahuatl language. So what they found when they carried out this curriculum, they had really good discussions, but they struggled to help the students move from responding emotionally to really critically examining the ideologies that motivated the behaviors. And then particularly in terms of the mock nahuatl, the students found it funny, but they couldn't get them to move beyond like, well, if you were a nahuatl speaker, how would you feel about this? So the grad students who led the sessions, they reflected on their, quote, failures to expand on the students' comments and to get them to use more of the interactional scaffolds. Okay, but I still want to point out that I think they're kind of hard on themselves because compared to their silence in a regular ELD classroom curriculum, they were talking a lot. So I think this is a first step. My big takeaway from this is that critical dialogic education is hard. Think about it. These are graduate students who are specifically trained to do nothing but this. They were trained by 2 experts in the field. They practice doing this with other students. They come in the classroom. They don't have to worry about anything else in the curriculum, anything else in the day, just this. And they themselves struggle to do this. And so it was kind of interesting when you read their reflections. It's full of things like, oh, we should have blank. We could have done this. We failed to do this. Had we done this, this would have happened. And so they're quite harsh on themselves. So I think what this means, my takeaway as a teacher educator is we've got our work cut out for us, right? We do talk a lot in our courses like, well, put them into groups and then magic will happen. And I think that this chapter and the many other chapters that we've already heard about shows us that magic doesn't happen unless you structure it, you scaffold it, you provide the supports that are needed. I think it shows that we need to take into consideration the language proficiency and the unique context of the students where they're at, so that we can't just take a canned curriculum and then bring in the kids if they don't do well in it. And I think that it also shows they were successful, for example, in getting the students engaging in more translanguaging strategies. It took a while because they were in a context where that wasn't allowed before. And so once they got more comfortable with the facilitators knowing what was allowed, then they were able to draw on all of their linguistic resources to kind of engage in these topics. But they also, of course, had to accommodate for the non-Spanish speakers. So for the Tagalog and the Mandarin speaker, it was kind of hard for them to grasp these memes mocking nahuatl, right? So especially when they were discussed in Spanish. It also means that we need to do a lot more in terms of training our teachers and our teacher candidates and productive talk moves and giving them practice with that. So I think others had already mentioned the need for us to model this in our own teacher education classrooms. What does critical dialogic education look like in our own classrooms? I'm thinking of ways that we can view videos and let our students, critique, what worked well, what didn't work well, and then designing their own lessons to teach and then viewing those videos and critiquing them. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you for raising how, and something that has been echoed in everybody, directly or indirectly, how difficult it is to engage students in substantive interactions at first, simply because it marks a big shift from modus operandi in classrooms, right? And if I may say so, especially in teacher education classes in universities, where dialogue traditionally has been missing more. So let's move into your specific role as teacher educators. Where do you see the potential for critical dialogic education? And especially, how would you respond to those colleagues that say, well, yes, that's a great idea, but that's not for English learners. After all, they are in the process of developing the language. How can they carry out critical discussions? And what are some of these shifts and how do you facilitate these shifts? And now it's going to be a real conversation. So I'll get a little bit out of the way and see how it all goes.
Well, first of all, the colleague who says that emergent bilingual kids, English learners, can't engage in critical dialogic education need to read these chapters, because there's ample evidence that people learning English can engage in critical topics with all of their linguistic repertoire, regardless of their English level. So I'll just start with that. So this is a good tool. I mean, the book is a good tool to provide teachers with inspiration in that sense. The kids are inspiring, and the teacher practices that are in there are inspiring, because it isn't an easy skill. I had a similar takeaway from the Lee chapter that even people, you know, explicitly trying to do this work and training at a doctoral level are struggling to make conversations rich in the image that they have in their minds. I think an important step for everybody at every level, including all of us doing teacher ed and trying to make these kinds of spaces in our own teacher ed classrooms, is to be kind to ourselves, to give ourselves grace, because often conversations are messy. We know that they're always messy, but often we'll step back afterwards and realize some really amazing revelations happened that we may not have been aware were happening right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
I would also just piggyback on something that Wayne said earlier, and just saying, you know, we really need to practice what we preach. And you know, I think some examples from our context. So in California, we have recent legislation saying that ethnic studies is going to be a graduation requirement in higher ed. We're seeing impetus for that in the kind of K-12 pathway as well. And so at least at San Jose State, we've been borrowing a lot and learning a lot from our colleagues in different ethnic studies department, in our case specifically Chicano studies, with whom we work very closely, and really trying to build some of those principles into our teaching such that it sets the conditions for productive dialogue, so that we can then conduct our classes dialogically and our candidates can conduct their teaching dialogically. So it's simple thing, right? It's simple and complex things. Some things like moving away from those, you know, favorite color, favorite food icebreakers to conocimiento, right? These forms of deep mutual knowing of each other, right? And really getting to know each other's life histories coming in, when we come into learning communities. And then going into more complex things like understanding the socio-historical contexts that are embedded when people from different backgrounds interact and things like that, and creating that awareness in dialogue. But so I think that setting up our teacher education classes in that way that, you know, Aida, you noted, is very difficult to do and is not often seen, right? It's often do as I say, not as I do in teacher ed. But so more and more trying to really model those practices, especially since in this era of high stakes testing based accountability, a lot of our candidates don't have a ton of exposure to it in their placement sites either. Right. So our classrooms become really important places for them to see that it works and to see that it can happen. And so maybe it doesn't happen along the lines of English proficiency, right? Maybe it happens along their lines of their grasp of theoretical concepts, but they can still see that they draw from their experiences, they draw from their mutual backgrounds, and they build together an understanding that then we can attach theoretical labels to it, right? And things like that. And so they build that, you know, that kind of vocabulary or terminology and discourse practices from those experiences and can carry those into their classrooms.
Thanks. I'd like to build on something Luis just said. And, you know, when we send students out to do their practicums, we can't always control what they see, right? And then you read the reflections and it's often reflecting on what not to do. And one of the things I really valued in this book are the really rich transcripts. Where you can really kind of, you know, deconstruct those conversations and see those points where, you know, the criticality is happening, the connections are happening, they're building on each other's ideas. And I think that as a profession, we need more good examples that we can point to. So, Amanda, I think at one point you mentioned that you guys hope to have like a video supplement to this book or something. I mean, maybe you can say a little bit more about that and, you know, ways that perhaps we can create those and share them as we engage in this work.
I think it's important work to be done. And yes, the logistics of publishing a book with live embedded with video it became a bit overwhelming in the current volume. But I think, we started out with that very idea of really understanding what this looks like in practice is a powerful model. And I was really struck, Emily, by what you said about, many of our teacher candidates haven't experienced this themselves. And so we really do need to create these conditions. And I think, there is this very careful idea of how do you create those conditions. And I think what we're showing and proposing is quite different than a traditional sort of front loading, preparing students so they can do something. We're actually suggesting they do that. And that, of course, you're designing things very, very thoughtfully, and there's so much behind it. But it really does challenge our ideas of what teaching and of what teaching language is. So I think it's profound, and it takes a lot of examples for us to do it. So I'll put that call out there to our community to engage in this work together.
Well, I would like to say that we have several videos from the chapter 1 lesson, and they can, I can just put them, we need to write something, but this is a great excuse, this conversation, putting it in the center website, to link it to the videos and the transcripts. So at least for that chapter, you will have that. Emily, we haven't heard, but I don't know that you want to say something because I have other topics to discuss.
Well, I'd say one thing that that I'm thinking about is if we have colleagues who are sort of skeptical about this work, I think it's important to also just underscore that critical dialogic education looks really different in different contexts. So we saw that across the chapters, but then even in my own work as a teacher educator of future early childhood teachers, I've been thinking a lot about what this looks like in, say, an early childhood setting. And I think it really resonates with a lot of approaches, student-centered approaches to early childhood that we're already learning about and talking about in teacher ed. So I thought a lot about what it might look like to give children opportunities to collaboratively build knowledge through practices like sociodramatic play or storytelling or art, how we could give students opportunities to critique and imagine more just worlds even through play. So I think really underscoring kind of how this can look different, but still keep those purposes of CDE at the forefront is something that can possibly help others kind of understand and see and apply this to their context as well.
Yes, that is definitely the case. The word shift was mentioned in 2 of your responses, the shifting. What shifts come to mind? Which are some of them, and what would be the facilitators of those shifts? And on the other hand, where are the constraints that teachers may experience? How do you prepare them for facing those difficult circumstances in teacher education?
Shifts, there's shifts on many levels. And one of the things that goes across all the chapters is the multi-level complexity of doing critical dialogues. And I think there are shifts that happen for teachers as they shift from the role of, giving to the role of moderating. That's a shift in dialogue, right? Shifts happen with kids that, I think it was Wayne who pointed out that the kids start to take on more responsibility for their own participation in class. No longer are they simply just following a teacher's directions or listening, but they're actually engaging and having a great deal more agency in the direction that lessons, ideas, contexts, and conversations will go. Then there's also shifting happening at the larger scale in order to allow these things to happen. So I think those are at least 3 shifts right there. And I know there's going to be more. The investment of kids is the one that's key to me in terms of that's what allows for the kinds of learning of both language and ideas that seem to matter. And the learning that matters it's another shift, I guess. That's what.
Right. Guadalupe, you wanted to say something?
Sorry, no, I didn't. Thank you very much. I'm just so excited to be listening. This is just very exciting. No, when I just put up on the in the chat was just because we have videos that people might be interested in looking at that were part of the team that was led by Laura Alvarez. So I just wanted people to see that.
Great.
Thank you.
I was thinking a simple shift just within a teacher education context. I'm thinking about some of the own assignments that we give. And so it's very typical to have, the students have to create a lesson plan. And we require that they have, content and language objectives. We require that they, have, different grouping strategies and stuff like that. And I think there needs to be a shift in terms of, well, again, what happens within that group? What are you actually doing to make sure that the students have the resources they need to be successful within that? And I think we need to shift away from things like sentence frames and other things that sometimes can be so constraining. I've been doing a lot of research in Indiana classrooms, and it's been breaking my heart to see these teachers do these turn and talks. And it's like, what is your favorite part of the story? There's a sentence frame. My favorite part of the story is the dog. My favorite part of the story is the cat, and boom, interaction is done. So we've got to, move beyond that somehow. So I think that's an important shift as well that starts in our teacher education classrooms.
Wayne, isn't it really a shift in how we understand language and language learning, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
From language being a curriculum, as Guadalupe would put it, a thing we have to teach systematically and learn systematically, to language being a tool for acting on the world.
Absolutely.
And
And
it makes me.
Sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead. No, you go ahead.
It just, it made me think about when we think about how to do that with teachers. One of the things that struck me that you said earlier, Luis, was about, really not paying attention to just our kids talking, but are they also listening? And this gets to your point too, Wayne, about like, if you're just going to follow a sentence frame, what are you listening to? And it does make me think that that's an important skill for us to teach teacher educators. And this was to some points in the chat too, about how do we focus on the students and their engagement in these ideas and their responsiveness to each other, because that's an important part of dialogic practice. Is you're not just getting ready to say something and you say it, but that you're engaging with others and you're sharing these ideas and building them upon each other. And that there was a comment in the chat also about, could we actually use participatory action research with our teacher candidates to do some of this work? And I think that's an interesting suggestion.
I think the Park chapter speaks to that a bit, with the multi-level nature of that participation with the students as part of the poetry project, also co-researchers in the project, breaking down the hierarchies, not only in the classroom in terms of pedagogy, but in terms of research and thinking about this as well. So our teacher candidates seeing themselves as inquiry, as sources of knowledge, as people who can go out and find the answers to their own questions, would in fact be modeling for themselves the very things they need to do with their kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a big shift in the sense that teachers are practically taught forever that they are the authority and they're there to correct and redirect. And that if, they don't intervene and correct, then something tragic is going to happen to students, right? So it's not just the freedom for teachers to fail, but it's give themselves the freedom to let things happen and to promote them by offering opportunities in the next class so that self-corrections can happen by part of the students themselves. And that is something that we seldom hear, right? But that I think is extremely important. Amanda, you were tracking the chat. Are there some questions that came from our audience that you would like to raise to our wonderful commentators?
Yeah, well, there's a lively discussion, and somehow some of you panelists are also in the discussion at the same time. You're incredible multitaskers. So, wow. And I think we'll keep moderating that, but I did see, Emily, you had unmuted, so I wanted to give you space on the floor to add.
I was just going to add that first chapter is just a really lovely and powerful example of a teacher who kind of steps back and lets things happen. So there are examples where there's some maybe misconceptions about what's happening in a photograph, that kind of thing. And Yael, the teacher, just does a really powerful job of kind of decentering her own authority, letting conversation happen, knowing that she can come back and address it at a later point. So if you want to see that in action, I would definitely check out that first chapter.
One thing that's really hard about this kind of learning engagement is that there really isn't a recipe for it, right? There really isn't also a right way or a wrong way to do it. And it's really hard to pin down. So in a sense, saying I know it when I see it, we're like, we need to be willing, as I think Laura Alvarez just said in the chat, to let mistakes happen and to let ambiguity in the door, the classroom. We're not in charge anymore as teachers or as teacher educators. Our students have just as much charge of what's happening and what's going to happen, which is scary. And that scariness is where the power is. So it's a matter of, we all want to see videos of how it's happened so we can do that. But at the same time, we need to have confidence in the spaces we're working in ourselves that we're going to make it there.
It also strikes me as I think about that, Deb, and I agree that we had also been talking about, I think last week, some of us have been speaking about the importance of teachers' mindsets as such a foundational part of this, of that teachers need to believe students can do this. And that this is who they are, and what they bring is actually the foundation and the basis for what lets them participate, rather than the other way around, right? Something that might impede their participation. It's that we start with them and where they are, and they can do this. And I was struck by that. I'll open that up if others have thoughts on that. But I was really struck by our earlier conversation, in which that was really so critical.
So I was thinking about focusing a bit on the fact that children don't know how to talk to other children about ideas. If you think about it, particularly young children, and if you look at all of the work that was done around accountable talk and socializing intelligence, and this was work that was done assuming that kids really did not know how to talk to other kids. And that's why they came up with this accountable talk, a set of ways of talking that then suffered what Anne Brown would have referred to as a lethal mutation and became sentence frames, right? And so, because the idea was children, especially, even if we just talk about very privileged children, when they talk to adults, the ways in which adults talk to them and enhance and embellish upon an idea is something that other children don't know how to do, right? So when we put children together to talk to each other, their expectations when they come up with a wonderful idea is really quite different, right? So it really is, if we're going to do this right, it really matters what we talk about. It matters whether we're talking about issues that engage them, for example, in their real life about things like immigration, or if we're talking about science, where the idea of right answers, okay, and getting the right views, okay, is very central to teachers. So it's not just talking, but what are we talking about? What is the content area in which this talk is going on, that I think we have to make certain that we are open to teachers and saying it's just not talk, and it won't be the same across a variety of things that you do, especially in elementary school, when you're talking about reading or we're talking about science. You just read a wonderful story, you could have opinions, but how do you guide kids into how you talk to each other respectfully? I think we still can draw from the accountable talk work that was done some years ago.
Yeah.
And it does make me think as well, talking about, what is this very profound what are these rich ideas and experiences we want to create for students, and the reasons we want them to engage so deeply. And I think a point that was made in the chat, and that I think our chapters all make as well, is that there needs to be a rich environment with so many different kinds of tools or affordances. People have been using different terms in the chat, but the ways in which we have multiple modalities, we have multiple languages, we have so many means of, as some people say, amplified means of bringing these complex ideas to students in ways that they are eager and able to talk about them, is profound. Because the complexity and the richness of the topic is what makes students want to engage in the first place. And I think also, to the point of what makes them engage, some points that our authors have made is that the relationships in the classroom matter too, and that kids want to talk, that they're responding to each other. They're not responding to, student A who holds opinion B. And so these relationships in the classroom are also so important, along with all of those resources and modalities.
One thing that I pulled out of the AERA chapter, but it was actually across all of them, is the importance of having diversity of people in the classroom too, in terms of their backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, their capacities with English, their experiences with the topics at hand, that the diversity of experiences contributes to the richness of the learning across the board, as long as we're having a dialogic experience, right? As long as everybody's voices matter in the space, and as long as we can build the space so that everybody's voices matter. The AERA chapter did this one comparison of interactions between when a kid's voice really did matter to their peers and when it didn't matter as much to their peers, and how different that looked in the interactional space.
And now that you're saying that, Deb, I think it's also very important to bring up an issue that we discussed last time with you, and that is that you may program what you want to happen in class, but that in the end, class takes or students take whatever it is that they notice and that really makes them feel valuable. And so it's that freedom teachers need to give themselves to just follow where students lead, gradually moving them and enhancing opportunities for development, right? And so to go back to Wayne's issue that in teacher education, you ask teachers to develop lessons as if lessons were fixed in time and space, right? And if students don't respond, then you need to kind of make them respond or continue going in the track set. Plans need to be in place so that they can be broken. As long as students keep learning and developing and following their passions, I think. And that's a very hard shift.
Yeah, it is. And I do know there's one point that just got raised in the chat. And I know it was important to all of us. So I wanted to make sure it got out before the end of our session. But the question of who...
Why don't you take the last 4 minutes to wrap up the conversation and you build in that point as well?
Okay, I can do that. The question that was posed was, who is critical dialogic education for? And I know we as a panel, we've talked about this, and that we very firmly believe, as I know our chapter authors do too, that this is for everyone. That this is not, we are speaking in terms of some of the particular ways that linguistically minoritized students, that learning opportunities can be shaped for them. But that dialogic and critical education is critical for all students. From one point, we think about equity. All students need to learn how to have the skills to engage critically, to engage dialogically for their own learning and for the community of learners in which they are. And I think that, as some have said, equity is a two-way street. And so all people need these skills. We cannot rely upon minoritized populations to build these critical and dialogic skills to somehow, fight an unjust system. So this is really something that we feel is critical and necessary for all students. So wanted to make sure that comes out. And I do think that I'll just leave us with maybe 30 seconds because I know Christina wants to wrap it up. That this is an important day, or maybe a day before an important day in US history. And when we think about this dialogic education and critical dialogic education, we have framed this also around what does it mean to participate in a democracy and to have a democratic process. And so I think that more than ever, this is such a salient topic, and one that actually provides us with a moment as teacher educators to bring this up maybe in new ways that we haven't before, or we haven't thought to, or quite known how to. But I think it shows us, one, how absolutely important and critical it is, and how we might have some spaces that we didn't before to do so. So I'll stop there, and Christina, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you so much, everyone, for this great conversation. Yes, lovely.
Yeah, I want to reiterate our gratitude for today's panelists and for your meaningful engagement with the edited volume. Thank you to the editors, and thank you to all of the chapter writers. for your contributions. I also want to shout out to Chris Bacon, Hansuk Cho, who are our SLR web and social media managers, as well as Jill Scott, the LSP grad student rep. I'm Christina Ponzio, the SLR SIG grad student rep. And we look forward to reconnecting with you all at our next webinar later this spring, or connecting with you at AERA 2021. And if you are not yet a member of either SIG, we do encourage you to join today. So thank you all once again, and be well.
Thank you.